Have you ever heard of the man who wrestled with God and had his life changed forever? Jacob, one of the most remarkable patriarchs in the Bible, experienced a journey filled with twists, challenges, and extraordinary encounters with the supernatural. His story is brimming with lessons on faith, persistence, and redemption. How can someone go from being a deceiver to becoming God's chosen leader? And what does his journey teach us about the power of divine transformation? Get ready for an emotional journey through the life of Jacob, the man who saw God face to face and had his destiny forever changed. If you love epic stories that touch the heart and challenge the soul, this video is for you. Jacob and Esau were born as twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah, grandchildren of Abraham, the patriarch of God's covenant. From the beginning, Jacob's story was marked by divine intervention, as his life was shaped to fulfill a greater purpose that would transcend his own generation. In Genesis 25:21, we read that Isaac, realizing his wife was barren, fervently prayed to the Lord, and God answered his plea, allowing Rebekah to conceive. However, this pregnancy was far from ordinary, as Rebekah felt the children struggling within her womb. Confused and concerned, she sought the Lord, who revealed a crucial prophecy about her family's future. According to Genesis 25:23, God told Rebekah, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." This divine word established the foundation of God's plan for Jacob and Esau, even before they were born. The struggle between the two in the womb was not merely physical, but also symbolic, representing the conflict that would define their relationship and their descendants. When the time came for the twins to be born, Esau emerged first, described in Genesis 25:25 as being red and covered with hair. However, right after him came Jacob, holding onto his brother's heel, a gesture noted in Genesis 25:26 that seemed to foreshadow his future attempt to surpass Esau and take the position of leadership. This moment was interpreted as a sign of the rivalry that would persist between the brothers throughout their lives. As the boys grew up, their personalities and interests diverged significantly. Genesis 25:27 describes Esau as a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. This striking difference also influenced the family dynamics. Isaac favored Esau because he enjoyed the taste of wild game his son brought home. Rebekah, on the other hand, preferred Jacob, possibly because she understood God's plan for him or simply due to maternal affinity. Rebekah's preference for Jacob played a crucial role in his story. She seemed to grasp the divine prophecy and made decisions throughout Jacob's life that aligned with the fulfillment of God's will. Jacob, though more reserved and introspective, grew up desiring the birthright, a spiritual and material privilege that belonged to the firstborn. This desire reflected his understanding of the importance of the divine blessing that accompanied the birthright, something Esau, as shown in Genesis 25:34, appeared to disdain. The episode where Jacob buys Esau's birthright is emblematic and is recorded in Genesis 25:29-34. One day, Esau returned exhausted from hunting and found Jacob cooking stew. Famished, Esau begged for food. Jacob saw this as an opportunity and demanded the birthright in exchange for a bowl of lentils. Esau, careless about spiritual matters, replied, "I am about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" Thus, he swore to sell his birthright to Jacob, displaying contempt for what was sacred and significant. The birthright was not merely a material privilege, but a symbol of divine blessing and the continuation of God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants. By claiming this right, Jacob began to position himself within God's plan, even though his methods were questionable. While his actions were shrewd, they aligned with God's prophecy that the older would serve the younger. The relationship between Isaac and Jacob highlights another key contrast in the narrative. While Isaac appeared to overlook God's plan by favoring Esau, Jacob found an ally in his mother, Rebekah. She not only loved him, but was also willing to act decisively to ensure the fulfillment of the divine prophecy. This is evident in the episode where she helps Jacob deceive Isaac to receive the paternal blessing, an event that will be explored further in the story. From the outset, Jacob's life was shaped by divine preparation. God orchestrated his story so that even amidst human flaws and controversial decisions, his sovereign purpose would prevail. As a young man, Jacob began to understand that his life was not just about family conflicts or personal achievements, but about a greater calling, a responsibility toward future generations. At this point in the story, Jacob is just beginning to walk the path God had laid out for him. His journey would be filled with challenges, transformative encounters, and experiences that would strengthen his faith and prepare him to become the patriarch of a nation that would bear the name Israel. Jacob found himself in a moment of great tension and fear. After deceiving his father, Isaac, to receive the blessing meant for his brother Esau, he had to face the consequences of his actions. In Genesis 27:41, the text reveals Esau's heart. Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob." Esau had resolved to take Jacob's life, and this threat soon reached the ears of their mother, Rebekah. Rebekah, concerned for Jacob's safety, intervened with wisdom and strategy. In Genesis 27:42-45, she called Jacob and warned him, "Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban my brother in Haran, and stay with him for a few days, until your brother's fury subsides, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you back from there. Why should I be bereaved of you both in one day?" This plan aimed to preserve Jacob's life, ensuring he escaped Esau's deadly wrath. To justify Jacob's departure to Isaac, Rebekah used a different argument. In Genesis 27:46, she told Isaac that the Hittite women, like Esau's wives, brought her great distress and suggested that Jacob be sent to Haran to find a wife among her relatives. Consequently, Isaac called Jacob and gave him clear instructions. In Genesis 28:1-2 we read, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take a wife for yourself from there, from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." This moment also provided an opportunity for Isaac to bless Jacob again, this time consciously acknowledging him as the bearer of the divine covenant. Isaac's blessing over Jacob in Genesis 28:3-4 is a pivotal moment. He said, "May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples, and may he give you the blessing of Abraham, to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham." With this blessing, Isaac confirmed that Jacob was the heir to God's covenant with Abraham, which included both spiritual blessings and the inheritance of the promised land. Jacob departed from Beersheba and journeyed toward Haran, as we read in Genesis 28:10. Then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. The journey was long and solitary. Jacob was leaving behind his home, his family, and everything familiar. He did not know what awaited him in Haran or if he would ever return. Along the way, he likely reflected on his actions, the deceit he had committed, and the uncertainty of his future. At one point during his journey, Jacob arrived at a place where he decided to spend the night. The sun had already set, so he took a stone and used it as a pillow, as described in Genesis 28:11. He came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set, and he took one of the stones of that place and put it under his head and lay down in that place. This seemingly simple act marked the beginning of one of the most significant moments of his life. While Jacob slept, he had an extraordinary dream, recounted in Genesis 28:12. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. This vision of the ladder connecting earth and heaven symbolized the link between the human and the divine, showing that God was attentive to Jacob's needs even in his flight. At the top of the ladder stood the Lord himself, who spoke directly to Jacob. In Genesis 28:13-15, God said, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Your descendants shall also be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you." This promise not only reaffirmed God's covenant with Abraham, but also guaranteed Jacob protection and guidance on his journey. When Jacob awoke, he was deeply moved and filled with awe. In Genesis 28:16-17, he said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." The realization of God's presence in that location transformed his perspective on his journey and his relationship with the Creator. The next morning, Jacob took the stone he had used as a pillow, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on it, consecrating the place. In Genesis 28:18-19, we read, "Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city had been Luz previously." Anointing the stone symbolized dedicating the place as sacred, a spiritual milestone for Jacob. Additionally, Jacob made a vow to God, recorded in Genesis 28:20-22. "If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I go, and give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you." This vow reflects Jacob's budding faith and his willingness to honor God in response to the divine promise. After this transformative encounter, Jacob continued his journey to Laban's household, now strengthened by the certainty that God was with him and that his promise would be fulfilled. The road ahead was still long, but God's presence had begun to shape Jacob's life definitively. Jacob continued his long journey to the land of Paddan Aram, where his maternal family lived. After the life-changing encounter with God at Bethel, he proceeded, fortified by the divine promise of protection and prosperity. In Genesis 29:1, we read that he arrived in the land of the people of the east. Upon his arrival, Jacob encountered a group of shepherds gathered near a well, waiting to water their flocks. He approached them and inquired about Laban, his uncle. In Genesis 29:5-6, the shepherds confirmed that they knew Laban and told him that Rachel, Laban's daughter, was approaching with her flock. Upon seeing Rachel, Jacob was immediately captivated. In Genesis 29:10, we read that upon realizing she was the daughter of Laban, he approached, removed the stone covering the well, and watered his cousin's flock. Afterward, he kissed her and wept aloud, as recorded in Genesis 29:11. This moment reflected a mixture of emotions: relief at finding his mother's relatives, joy at meeting Rachel, and the impact of the arduous journey he had endured. Rachel ran to inform Laban of Jacob's arrival. In Genesis 29:13, upon hearing the news, Laban hurried to meet Jacob, embraced him, kissed him, and brought him to his house. Jacob recounted everything that had happened, and Laban welcomed him as family, saying, "You are indeed my own flesh and blood." Genesis 29:14. Jacob began working in Laban's household, and it soon became evident how deeply he loved Rachel. In Genesis 29:15, Laban proposed that Jacob should not work without payment and asked what his wages should be. Jacob replied in Genesis 29:18, "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." The agreement was made, and Jacob dedicated himself to the work with zeal and devotion. Genesis 29:20 tells us, "So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her." After 7 years, Jacob asked Laban to fulfill his part of the agreement and give Rachel to him as his wife. However, Laban, known for his cunning, planned to deceive Jacob. In Genesis 29:22-23, Laban arranged a wedding feast, and that night brought Leah, his older daughter, to Jacob. Unaware of the switch, Jacob consummated the marriage with Leah. In the morning, realizing the deceit, Jacob confronted Laban. In Genesis 29:25, he asked, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban replied in Genesis 29:26, "It is not our custom here to give the younger before the firstborn." He then proposed a new arrangement. If Jacob agreed to work another 7 years, he could also marry Rachel after fulfilling Leah's bridal week. Deeply in love with Rachel, Jacob accepted the terms. In Genesis 29:28, we read that Jacob completed the week with Leah and then received Rachel as his wife, whom he loved more than Leah. Despite having Rachel by his side, the family dynamics were complicated. Leah, though unloved, became Jacob's first wife to bear children, as God saw that she was rejected. In Genesis 29:31, it is written, "When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." Leah gave birth to 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Each name reflected her longing to be loved and recognized by Jacob. Meanwhile, Rachel remained childless, though Jacob remained devoted to her. Throughout his years of service in Laban's household, Jacob faced not only the emotional challenges of his marital life, but also the difficulties imposed by his uncle. Laban was a shrewd and manipulative man who repeatedly tried to exploit Jacob. Yet God continued to bless Jacob's work. In Genesis 30:27, Laban acknowledged, "I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." When the time came for Jacob to leave, he negotiated with Laban again, proposing an agreement to divide the flocks. Jacob suggested he would take the speckled, spotted, and striped animals, while Laban would keep the solid-colored ones. Laban agreed, but immediately tried to deceive Jacob once more by removing the speckled and spotted animals before Jacob could tend the flock. However, God was with Jacob and blessed his breeding strategy, causing his flocks to multiply greatly. In Genesis 30:43 we read, "Thus the man grew exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, camels and donkeys." Despite Laban's tricks and schemes, Jacob prospered because God was fulfilling his promise to bless and protect him. As time passed, the relationship between Jacob and Laban deteriorated. Laban's sons grew envious of Jacob's wealth, and Laban's attitude toward him changed. Yet Jacob understood that his prosperity came not from his own efforts, but from God's hand, fulfilling the promise made at Bethel. While Jacob worked faithfully and built his family, he remained mindful of God's promise that he would return to the land of his fathers and become the father of a great nation. The tensions with Laban and the growth of his wealth signaled that the time to leave was drawing near. Jacob knew he would have to make difficult decisions, but trusted God's guidance. After many years working in Laban's household and amassing great wealth through God's favor, Jacob reached a point where remaining in that land became unsustainable. In Genesis 31:1-2 we read, Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, "Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all this wealth." And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. The growing tension between Jacob, Laban, and his sons made it clear that Jacob's presence was no longer welcome. However, it was God who gave Jacob the definitive confirmation that it was time to leave. In Genesis 31:3, God spoke directly to Jacob, saying, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." This divine command was not only a call to return, but also a promise that God would remain with him, just as he had promised earlier at Bethel. Jacob understood that obeying this call would be challenging, but trusted in God's protection and provision. Before taking action, Jacob called Rachel and Leah to the field where his flocks were and spoke with them about his decision. In Genesis 31:4-5, he said, "I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me." Jacob explained how he had been honest and hard-working during all the years he served Laban, but Laban had changed his wages 10 times. He also told his wives how God had intervened on his behalf and prospered the work of his hands, as recorded in Genesis 31:7-9. Jacob also shared a dream he had in which the angel of God appeared to him and reaffirmed the command to return to the land of his fathers. In Genesis 31:11-13, he recounted, "The angel of God said to me in the dream, 'Jacob,' and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land.'" After hearing all this, Rachel and Leah agreed it was time to leave, acknowledging that their father Laban had not acted justly toward Jacob. Thus, Jacob made his decision. He gathered his wives, children, servants, maids, and all his possessions and flocks. In Genesis 31:17-18, we read that he put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. Fearing possible retaliation from Laban, Jacob decided to leave without informing him. During their departure, a significant incident occurred. In Genesis 31:19, we read that Rachel stole her father's household gods, an act that would later cause conflict. Despite this, Jacob continued his journey in haste, crossing the Euphrates River and heading toward the hill country of Gilead, as described in Genesis 31:21. When Laban discovered Jacob had left, he was furious and gathered his relatives to pursue him. In Genesis 31:22-23, it is written, "On the 3rd day Laban was told that Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead." However, God once again intervened on Jacob's behalf. In a dream, God appeared to Laban and warned him, saying, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Genesis 31:24. This divine warning prevented Laban from acting violently toward Jacob. When Laban finally caught up with Jacob, he confronted him, accusing him of leaving secretly and stealing his household gods. In Genesis 31:26-30, Laban questioned Jacob, "What have you done? You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me, so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you. But last night, the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" Jacob firmly responded to the accusations. He explained that he fled because he feared Laban might take his daughters by force. As for the household gods, Jacob, unaware that Rachel had stolen them, declared, "If you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live." Genesis 31:32. Laban searched through all the tents but did not find the gods, as Rachel had hidden them. Following the search, Jacob took the opportunity to confront Laban about the years of service and injustice he had endured. In Genesis 31:38-41, he said, "I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. Recognizing that God was with Jacob, Laban proposed a covenant. In Genesis 31:44, he said, "Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us." They set up a heap of stones as a witness to the covenant, and Laban invoked the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor as witnesses, while Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Genesis 31:53. The covenant was sealed with a meal and established boundaries between them, ensuring there would be no future hostilities. After the covenant, Laban kissed his grandchildren and daughters, blessed them, and returned home. Jacob, on the other hand, continued his journey toward the land of his fathers, knowing he was about to meet his brother Esau, a meeting fraught with uncertainty and challenges. After parting ways with Laban and heading toward his homeland, Jacob knew he needed to face an unresolved issue from his past: his brother Esau. He had left Canaan years earlier to escape Esau's wrath after deceiving him in the matter of Isaac's blessing. Now, as he returned, he knew this meeting was inevitable, and he carried with him a mix of fear and hope. In Genesis 32:1-2, we read that as Jacob went on his way, the angels of God met him. When he saw them, Jacob said, "This is the camp of God?" So he named that place Mahanaim, meaning 2 camps. This vision was a reminder that God was with him. But even so, the fear of reuniting with Esau remained. Determined to prepare himself, Jacob sent messengers ahead to inform Esau of his arrival. In Genesis 32:3-5, he instructed the messengers to say, "This is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there until now. I have cattle, donkeys, sheep, goats, male and female servants. I am sending this message to my lord, that I may find favor in your eyes." Jacob referred to Esau as "my lord," and to himself as "your servant," a gesture of humility and submission intended to pacify his brother's anger. The messengers returned with alarming news. In Genesis 32:6, they reported, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." This news filled Jacob with fear and distress. He was uncertain of Esau's intentions, and the fact that Esau was accompanied by so many men seemed like a prelude to conflict. Jacob's fear grew, and he began devising strategies to protect his family and possessions. In Genesis 32:7-8, we read that Jacob divided his flocks, servants, and family into 2 groups, thinking, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. This division was an attempt to minimize losses in case Esau acted with hostility. Jacob used his strategic abilities, but recognized that the situation required more than human wisdom. He needed to call upon God. Jacob's prayer, recorded in Genesis 32:9-12, is one of the most sincere and humble moments of his life. He began by acknowledging who God is. "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper." Jacob admitted his unworthiness, saying, "I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps." He pleaded for deliverance. "Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children." Finally, Jacob reminded God of his promises, reaffirming his trust. "But you have said, 'I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted.'" After praying, Jacob decided to send gifts to Esau as a gesture of reconciliation. In Genesis 32:13-15, we read that he selected a large number of animals: 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He arranged these animals in herds and instructed his servants to drive them ahead, leaving space between each group. In Genesis 32:17-18, he gave specific instructions. "When my brother Esau meets you and asks, 'To whom do you belong?' and 'Where are you going?' and 'Who owns all these animals in front of you?' and then you are to say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us.'" Jacob hoped these gifts would appease Esau's anger. In Genesis 32:20, he reasoned, "I will pacify him with these gifts I am sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me." The gifts were sent ahead, while Jacob remained in the camp with his family. That night, however, fear and anxiety overtook Jacob. He knew the next day could determine the future of his lineage and possibly his own life. In Genesis 32:22-23, we read that during the night, Jacob got up, took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok with all his possessions. He remained alone, seeking a moment of introspection and prayer. Jacob's solitude that night marked the culmination of his preparation. He had done everything possible from a human perspective, divided his assets, sent gifts, organized his family, and prayed fervently. Now, alone by the Jabbok River, Jacob awaited dawn, knowing the encounter with Esau was inevitable and that only divine intervention could ensure a peaceful outcome. After sending his family and possessions across the river, Jacob stayed behind, alone. This moment of solitude was deeply significant, as Jacob was about to face one of the most challenging and transformative nights of his life. In Genesis 32:24, we read, "So Jacob was left alone, isolated from his loved ones and any human protection. Jacob experienced a night filled with introspection, fears, and uncertainty about the future. He knew dawn would bring the unavoidable meeting with Esau, but first he would confront something much greater. That night, while Jacob was alone, a mysterious man appeared. Genesis 32:24 continues, "And a man wrestled with him till daybreak." This man was not immediately identified, but his presence introduced a physical and spiritual challenge. The struggle between Jacob and this being was intense and lasted all night until the break of day. This was not merely a physical contest. It was a direct confrontation with everything Jacob had been up to that point. His insecurities, fears, and even his identity as a deceiver were being put to the test. The man Jacob wrestled with was no ordinary adversary. In Genesis 32:25 we read, "When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man." This touch, which injured Jacob, demonstrated the man's supernatural power. Even though he was injured, Jacob refused to let go. He clung to the man with all his strength, determined not to let him go without receiving a blessing. Jacob's persistence is one of the most remarkable moments in this narrative. In Genesis 32:26, the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Jacob's response reveals his determination and complete reliance on divine blessing. He recognized that without God's intervention, he could not move forward. Jacob was willing to wrestle until the end to ensure his life was transformed. The man then asked a question that would forever change Jacob's story. In Genesis 32:27, he asked, "What is your name?" Jacob replied, "Jacob." This moment is profound because the name Jacob, meaning he who grasps the heel or deceiver, was directly tied to his identity and past actions. By stating his name, Jacob acknowledged who he was, but also opened the way for a new identity. The man declared in Genesis 32:28, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." The new name Israel means he who struggles with God, or Prince of God. This name change symbolized a deep transformation in Jacob's life. He would no longer be defined by his past of deceit and conflict, but by his new role as God's chosen leader, someone who had faced and overcome both spiritual and human challenges. After receiving his new name, Jacob asked the man a question. In Genesis 32:29, he said, "Please tell me your name." However, the man did not reveal his name, but instead blessed Jacob right there. This moment sealed Jacob's transformation and confirmed that the encounter was with someone who represented the divine presence. Jacob then named the place Peniel, meaning face of God. In Genesis 32:30, he said, "I have seen God face to face, and my life has been preserved." The struggle at Peniel was a direct encounter with God, a moment of profound spiritual significance. Jacob left that place, marked both physically with a displaced hip and spiritually with a new identity and a renewed understanding of his purpose. At daybreak, Jacob departed from Peniel, limping because of his injured hip. In Genesis 32:31, we read, "The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip." This detail symbolizes that Jacob's experience was not only a spiritual encounter, but also a physical milestone in his life. He would never forget that night, as he carried the mark of his struggle with God on his body. Now, transformed and strengthened, Jacob moved forward, knowing that his next challenge was meeting Esau. Despite uncertainty about how his brother would receive him, Jacob advanced, trusting in God's promise and his new identity. He was no longer just Jacob, the deceiver. He was Israel, the man who had struggled with God and prevailed. After the long night of wrestling at Peniel, Jacob faced the dawn with a new identity and renewed confidence in God. But an immediate challenge still loomed: the encounter with Esau. Since the day he fled from Canaan, the fear of Esau had haunted him. Jacob knew he could not return to his father's land without resolving the conflict with his brother. In Genesis 33:1, the text states, "Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him." Esau's approach with a large group only heightened Jacob's anxiety, suggesting a possible act of revenge. Determined to seek reconciliation, Jacob trusted in God's promise of protection and carefully arranged his family and possessions. In Genesis 33:2, we read that he placed the maidservants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. This arrangement may reflect both a strategy to safeguard his dearest loved ones and his resolve to face Esau before exposing his family to danger. Jacob then took the lead, advancing alone, demonstrating both courage and humility. As he approached, Esau Jacob bowed to the ground 7 times, as recorded in Genesis 33:3. This act of respect and submission signified his desire for peace, not conflict. Jacob's repeated bowing also reflected his humility before Esau, acknowledging the wrong he had done in the past and seeking his brother's mercy. This symbolic act was powerful, especially considering how much Jacob had changed since their last meeting. What happened next was entirely unexpected. In Genesis 33:4, we read, "But Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept." Esau did not react with hostility or vengeance, but with fraternal love. He ran to meet Jacob, embraced him warmly, kissed him, and both brothers wept together. This moment of reconciliation was deeply moving. The embrace symbolized Esau's forgiveness and the restoration of their relationship, something only divine intervention could have made possible. After the embrace, Esau began to speak with Jacob. In Genesis 33:5, he looked at Jacob's family and asked, "Who are these with you?" Jacob replied, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." By presenting his family, Jacob acknowledged God's hand in his life, attributing his blessings not to his own efforts, but to divine grace. Each of Jacob's children, along with their mothers, approached and bowed before Esau in a gesture of respect and reverence. As the brothers talked, Esau noticed the gifts Jacob had sent ahead. In Genesis 33:8 he asked, "What do you mean by all these droves I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in your eyes, my lord." Jacob viewed the gifts as a way to seek reconciliation and show his sincerity. However, Esau replied in Genesis 33:9, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Despite Esau's initial reluctance, Jacob insisted that he accept the gifts, explaining, "Please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me and I have all I need." Genesis 33:11. Esau finally accepted, sealing their reconciliation. After the exchange of forgiveness and gifts, Esau suggested that they travel together. In Genesis 33:12 he said, "Let us start on our journey, and I will go ahead of you." However, Jacob, mindful of the slower pace of his children and livestock, asked to proceed at his own pace. He said in Genesis 33:13-14, "My Lord knows that the children are tender, and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard even one day, all the animals will die. So let my Lord go on ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me and the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." Esau agreed, demonstrating the genuineness of their reconciliation and his respect for Jacob's needs. Before departing, Esau offered to leave some of his men with Jacob to assist him along the way, but Jacob politely declined, saying, "Why do that? Just let me find favor in the eyes of my Lord." Genesis 33:15. Esau then returned to Seir, while Jacob continued his journey with his family and flocks, heading towards Succoth. The reunion between Jacob and Esau was one of the most emotional and significant moments in both of their lives. It not only restored peace between the two brothers, but also highlighted God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Jacob had left Canaan in fear for his life, and now he returned safely, not because of his strategies or plans, but because God had worked to reconcile him with Esau. This meeting was a testimony to the power of forgiveness and divine grace, capable of transforming even the most fractured relationships. Jacob, however, understood that there was still more to his journey. The reconciliation with Esau was only a step toward fulfilling God's calling in his life. He continued to move forward, intent on realizing the promises of God, fully aware that the Lord was with him every step of the way. After his reunion with Esau and his journey to Succoth, Jacob pressed on in obedience to God's plan. In Genesis 35:1, God spoke to Jacob again, calling him to return to Bethel, the place where, years earlier, he had the vision of the heavenly ladder and made a vow to the Lord. The text states, "Arise, go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau." This call was a reminder that God was fulfilling his promises, and that Jacob needed to renew his commitment to the Lord. In response to God's command, Jacob recognized the need for his family to be spiritually prepared for this moment of consecration. In Genesis 35:2, he said to his household and all who were with him, "Get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves and change your clothes." Jacob understood that presenting themselves before God required his family to abandon all forms of idolatry. This act was not just physical, but represented a spiritual purification, a definitive separation from practices contrary to the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's household promptly obeyed. In Genesis 35:4 we read, "So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had, and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem." This act of burying the idols symbolized renouncing anything that might interfere with their worship of God. After this, Jacob and his family set out for Bethel. Throughout their journey, God protected Jacob and his household from any threats. Genesis 35:5 says, "Then they set out, and the terror of God fell on the towns all around them so that no one pursued them." God's presence was evident, ensuring that no one hindered his purposes for Jacob's life. Upon reaching Bethel, Jacob obeyed God's instructions. In Genesis 35:7, we read that he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. The construction of the altar marked a spiritual milestone, where Jacob acknowledged God's faithfulness from the time he fled from Esau until that day. There, he renewed his covenant with the Lord, recalling the promises made and the commitments established. While at Bethel, God appeared to Jacob once more and reaffirmed his name change to Israel. In Genesis 35:10, God said, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel." This declaration emphasized that Jacob was no longer defined by his past of deceit, but by his new identity as God's chosen leader. God then reiterated the promises made to Abraham and Isaac, saying in Genesis 35:11-12, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you." This reaffirmation of the divine covenant was a reminder that God was fulfilling his eternal plan through Jacob and his descendants. After this spiritual moment in Bethel, Jacob continued his journey with his family. Along the way, they faced a heartbreaking loss. In Genesis 35:16, we learn that Rachel went into labor as they traveled to Ephrath, but her delivery was difficult. During childbirth, Rachel endured great suffering, and her life came to an end. In her final moments, she named her son Ben-Oni, meaning son of my sorrow. However, Jacob renamed him Benjamin, meaning son of my right hand. Genesis 35:18. This renaming reflected Jacob's resilience in the face of pain and his view of Benjamin as a blessing, even under such tragic circumstances. Jacob buried Rachel on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem, and set up a pillar over her grave, as recorded in Genesis 35:19-20. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day, that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. This memorial stood as a tribute to Jacob's deep love for Rachel, the wife he had worked 14 years to marry in Laban's household. Despite Rachel's loss, Jacob's family continued to grow, and his sons became the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. In Genesis 35:22-26, the text lists Jacob's sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Each would play a vital role in shaping God's people. The multiplication of Jacob's descendants was a direct fulfillment of God's promise that he would be the father of a great nation. Jacob, now called Israel, was beginning to grasp the depth of God's promises. At every stage of his life, God had been faithful, even when Jacob faced hardships, losses, and conflicts. He understood that God's covenant extended beyond his own life to future generations. God's promise to bless all the nations of the earth through Jacob's offspring was a plan that transcended time and culminated in God's eternal purpose for humanity. Jacob continued his journey, leading his family and flocks with faith in the God who had guided him from the start. He knew that despite the challenges ahead, God was with him, fulfilling every promise he had made. Jacob's story, now as Israel, was one of transformation, divine faithfulness, and hope for the future as God's promises never fail. After Rachel's death on the way to Ephrath, later known as Bethlehem, Jacob entered a new phase of his journey. Rachel's loss was a devastating blow, as she was the great love of his life, the woman for whom he had worked 14 years in Laban's house. Jacob set up a memorial pillar over her grave, as recorded in Genesis 35:20, and moved forward with his 12 sons, who would become the foundations of the 12 tribes of Israel. Despite his grief, Jacob continued to lead his family. However, another challenging event soon shook his household. In Genesis 35:22, it is recorded that Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, had relations with Bilhah, his father's concubine. This act was a direct affront to Jacob's authority and brought great dishonor to the family. Although Jacob's immediate reaction is not recorded, the incident had lasting consequences. Later, during his final blessings, Jacob rebuked Reuben, saying in Genesis 49:4, "Unstable as water, you shall not excel, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it." This incident highlighted the challenges Jacob faced in managing the complex dynamics of a large family with internal conflicts. Amid internal tensions, Jacob continued to witness God's faithfulness. In Genesis 35:27-29, the text recounts Jacob's return to his father Isaac's house in Hebron in the land of Canaan. Isaac lived to the advanced age of 180 years, and his death marked the end of an era. Jacob and Esau came together to bury him, demonstrating that despite their past conflicts, the two brothers managed to maintain peace. The following years brought new blessings and challenges for Jacob, particularly regarding his sons. Jacob's relationship with Joseph, his firstborn with Rachel, became a central focus in the narrative. In Genesis 37:3, it is written that Jacob loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. This favoritism was evident and caused great jealousy among Joseph's brothers, fueling conflicts within the family. Driven by envy, Joseph's brothers plotted against him. Initially planning to kill him, they instead sold him as a slave to Ishmaelite traders heading to Egypt. They then faked his death, presenting Jacob with Joseph's bloodstained coat. In Genesis 37:34-35, Jacob's profound grief is described. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Jacob believed he had lost Joseph forever, and his sorrow lingered as an open wound for many years. While Jacob mourned Joseph's loss, God was orchestrating something extraordinary in Egypt. Joseph, though sold as a slave, was elevated to the position of governor, responsible for managing resources during a time of severe famine. This famine spread across the region, forcing Jacob to send his sons to Egypt to buy food. In Genesis 42:1-2, Jacob said to them, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." Jacob's sons traveled, to Egypt, unaware that they would meet Joseph, who had become a powerful and unrecognizable figure. After a series of encounters and tests, Joseph revealed his identity. When the brothers returned to Canaan with the news that Joseph was alive, Jacob initially did not believe them. Genesis 45:26-27 recounts, "And they told him, saying, 'Joseph is still alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt.' And Jacob's heart stood still, because he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words which Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. This news brought renewed vigor to Jacob, and he decided to journey to Egypt to reunite with his son. Before departing, Jacob sought God's guidance. In Genesis 46:1-4, it is written that he offered sacrifices to the Lord, and God spoke to him in a vision at night. "Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes." With this divine assurance, Jacob gathered his entire family and set out for Egypt. The reunion between Jacob and Joseph was one of the most emotional moments of Jacob's life. In Genesis 46:29-30, we read, "Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, 'Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive.'" The reunion brought joy and peace to Jacob's heart, as he had believed he had lost Joseph forever. Jacob spent his final 17 years in Egypt, living in peace and prosperity alongside his children and grandchildren. Genesis 47:27 records, "Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number." During this time, Jacob prepared his family for the future, passing down his faith and ensuring they would remember God's promises. When Jacob sensed that his death was near, he called for Joseph and made a solemn request. In Genesis 47:29-30, he said, "Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." Joseph swore to fulfill his father's wish, and Jacob bowed in worship. Before his death, Jacob blessed his sons and proclaimed prophetic words over each of them, revealing the destinies of their tribes. He also blessed Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, adopting them as his own. In Genesis 48:5, he said, "Now then, your 2 sons born to you in Egypt before I came to you here will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine." This adoption ensured that Joseph's lineage would hold a significant place among the tribes of Israel. After blessing his sons, Jacob reiterated his desire to be buried in the cave of Machpelah in the land of Canaan, alongside Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah. In Genesis 49:33, we read of his passing. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Joseph and his brothers honored Jacob's wishes. In Genesis 50:12-13, it is written, "So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah." Jacob's burial was a testament to his faith in God's promises, which guaranteed that this land would belong to his descendants. Jacob's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on through his children and the divine promise of forming a great nation. His story stands as a powerful example of how God uses imperfect people to fulfill his eternal purposes. And so, we conclude this incredible journey through Jacob's story, a man who, despite his flaws and challenges, was transformed by God's grace and chosen to fulfill an eternal purpose. His life teaches us the importance of faith, repentance, reconciliation, and trust in God's promises, which are always fulfilled. If this story touched your heart or brought new insights about the Bible, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Don't forget to leave a like, comment on what impacted you the most, and share this video with your friends and family. Together, we can spread the message of God's Word to even more people. May God bless you, and see you in the next video.